You won't believe what happened that afternoon. I was just folding laundry, minding my own business, when my husband's colleague showed up at our front door, and what followed still plays in my mind like a scene from a film. Before I tell you everything, let me ask, where are you watching from tonight? I love knowing where my listeners come from. It feels like we're all sitting around the same kitchen table. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and tap that little like button. It truly helps me keep sharing these personal stories that somehow always seem to touch the heart in unexpected ways. Now, let me take you back to that day. It was an ordinary Thursday, one of those gray afternoons when time moves a little slower. The house was quiet except for the steady hum of the dryer and the faint ticking of the clock above the mantel. I was standing in the laundry room, folding my husband's shirts into neat rectangles, his usual pale blues and soft grays, thinking about what to cook for dinner. The scent of fabric softener mixed with a hint of rain through the open window. It felt peaceful, comfortable, familiar. Then I heard the doorbell. At first, I thought it might be the delivery man, maybe another package my husband ordered for work. But when I wiped my hands on a towel and walked to the front door, I saw someone standing there I hadn't expected to see. Michael. He was my husband's colleague, someone I'd met a few times at company dinners. Tall, polite, with kind eyes and a certain calm about him. Not handsome in the obvious way, but there was something grounded and sincere about him that always stood out. "Linda," he said, smiling gently. "I hope I'm not intruding. I was just passing through the neighborhood and thought I'd drop off the documents Tom asked for." I hesitated for a moment. Tom, my husband, was away on a short business trip, due back the next evening. Still, it seemed innocent enough. I opened the door wider. "Oh, Michael, of course. Come in. You're saving me a trip to the office." He stepped inside, brushing a few raindrops from his jacket. The scent of rain followed him, clean and earthy. I led him to the living room, where he placed a brown envelope on the coffee table. We exchanged a few polite words, the kind of small talk that fills the space between two people who don't quite know each other well enough to be comfortable in silence. But something was different that day. Maybe it was the way the rain tapped against the windows, or how the soft afternoon light filtered through the curtains, wrapping everything in gold. There was a stillness that seemed to invite honesty, or maybe just loneliness. I can't say which. "Would you like some coffee?" I asked. "Or tea?" He smiled, a little hesitant but warm. "Coffee sounds nice, thank you." In the kitchen, I busied myself with the familiar rhythm, water boiling, mugs clinking, the faint hiss of steam. Michael leaned against the doorway, his hands in his pockets, watching me with a kind of easy attentiveness that caught me off guard. It wasn't intrusive, just noticing. "Tom always says you make the best coffee," he said lightly. I laughed. "Oh, he says that about everything I make. I think he just likes being spoiled." Michael smiled again, but there was something thoughtful behind it. "He's a lucky man." That simple sentence hung in the air longer than I expected. It wasn't flirtation. It didn't feel like that, but rather an acknowledgement, one person recognizing the quiet work of another, the kind that often goes unseen. We sat at the kitchen table, sipping coffee while the rain picked up outside. He told me about a new project at work, how stressful things had been lately, and how much he admired the way Tom handled pressure. I listened, nodding, offering small bits of encouragement. But as he talked, I noticed the faint tiredness in his eyes, the kind that comes not from lack of sleep, but from carrying too much for too long. When the conversation paused, there was a silence that didn't feel empty. Just soft. Familiar in its own strange way. I realized I hadn't had a conversation like that in a long time, one where no one was rushing, where words seemed to matter. Then he said something that caught me off guard. "You know, Linda, it's rare to meet someone who makes a house feel like a home. You have that warmth about you." I felt my cheeks flush. It wasn't a compliment about appearance. It was deeper, quieter. And for a woman my age, that kind of sincerity can be disarming. I smiled, setting my mug down. That's kind of you to say. I suppose I've always found comfort in taking care of the small things. We talked for what must have been over an hour, though it felt like minutes. The rain finally slowed, the air cooling as the sky darkened. He stood to leave, thanking me for the coffee, for the company. And when he reached for his coat, our hands brushed, just for a moment. A spark of something, familiar, yet new, passed between us. Not passion, not even longing, but recognition. The kind that says, I see you. I walked him to the door, and as he stepped out onto the porch, he turned back slightly. You know, Linda, sometimes the smallest moments end up meaning the most. I watched him walk to his car, the sound of gravel crunching beneath his shoes, the rain glistening on his shoulders. When he drove away, the house felt both quieter and somehow louder, like something had shifted, even if only slightly. That night, as I finished folding the last of the laundry, I thought about how life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it. Not with grand gestures or dramatic twists, but with a simple conversation over coffee on a rainy day. And though I didn't yet know it, that small moment would change the way I saw everything, from my marriage to myself. The next morning began like any other, though I carried a quiet restlessness in my chest that I couldn't quite name. The rain had cleared overnight, leaving the world outside looking washed and new. Sunlight spilled through the curtains, falling in golden strips across the kitchen floor. I poured my first cup of coffee, listening to the steady hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the wall clock, and the occasional bird outside. Yet somehow, everything felt different. Maybe it was just that the house was too quiet without Tom. Or maybe it was because, no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop thinking about that brief moment with Michael, the way his voice softened when he spoke, or how our hands had brushed at the door. It wasn't romance, not really. It was something smaller, but somehow more unsettling. It had reminded me that I was still capable of feeling something unexpected. I tried to shake it off. After all, I had things to do. Laundry to finish, errands to run. But the mind has its own ways of looping, doesn't it? You replay a single sentence, a single look, until it starts to mean more than it should. By mid-afternoon, I decided to distract myself. I went into town to pick up groceries, the kind of mundane task that usually calms me. The store was half empty. Midday on a Friday always is. I moved through the aisles slowly, the wheels of my cart squeaking softly. Tomatoes, bread, a new bag of coffee beans. My hands moved on autopilot, but my thoughts were far away. It wasn't until I reached the checkout line that I noticed my phone buzz. A new message. Hi, Linda. Hope you don't mind me saying this, but I really enjoyed our chat yesterday. It was nice to slow down for a bit. Michael. I stared at the screen for a long moment, the words simple but disarming. I typed back before I could overthink it. It was nice having company. Safe drive yesterday, I hope. The rain was terrible. A moment later, the little dots appeared. Made it home fine. Thanks again for the coffee. And the kindness. Most people these days don't take the time to talk. I smiled without meaning to. There was something old-fashioned about his tone. Courteous. Gentle. I tucked my phone back into my purse, telling myself it was harmless, a polite exchange between acquaintances. But as I loaded the groceries into the car, I felt that quiet flutter again, like the soft beat of wings just beneath the ribs. When I returned home, the late afternoon sun had begun to dip behind the trees. I set the groceries on the counter and noticed one of Tom's old shirts draped over a chair. I picked it up, smoothing out the wrinkles. It smelled faintly of aftershave and detergent. I felt a pang of guilt then. How easily my mind had wandered toward another man, even in thought. Tom had always been a good husband, steady, reliable, the kind of man who fixed the leaky faucet before you had to ask. But life with him had become quiet. Too quiet. That evening, as I cooked dinner, I found myself thinking back to the early days of our marriage, the laughter, the closeness. How we used to talk late into the night about everything and nothing. Somewhere along the way, the conversations had turned into logistics, bills, groceries, plans. The rhythm of love had softened into routine. I didn't resent it. It's just, I missed being seen. Later, while washing dishes, my phone buzzed again. Sorry to bother you. Just wanted to ask if Tom got the documents all right. I dried my hands and replied, he's back tomorrow morning. I'll make sure he gets them. He wrote back, great. And Linda, I meant what I said yesterday. You make people feel at ease. It's a rare gift. For a while, I just stared at the words glowing on the screen. Compliments used to come often years ago, before gray strands and laugh lines became my daily mirror companions. Now, they were like small, forgotten treasures found unexpectedly. I typed, "Thank you, Michael. That's very kind of you to say." He didn't reply right away, and I didn't expect him to. I placed the phone down and stepped onto the back porch. The evening air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of wet grass and pine. Fireflies flickered across the yard like tiny sparks. I closed my eyes and let the quiet settle around me. It wasn't attraction, I told myself. Not really. It was connection. A simple reminder that I was still here, alive, capable of being noticed. When Tom returned the next morning, he was tired but cheerful, his arms full of luggage and his phone already buzzing with messages from work. I made him breakfast, listened as he talked about the meetings, the endless emails. I nodded, smiled, said all the right words. But part of me was elsewhere, wondering why I suddenly felt like a guest in my own home. That afternoon, while Tom took a nap, I went to the garden to trim the hydrangeas. The sun was warm on my shoulders, the soil damp beneath my shoes. And then, as if the universe enjoyed teasing me, I heard a car pull into the driveway. It was Michael again. He stepped out, holding a folder in one hand, a polite smile on his face. I hope this isn't a bad time. Tom mentioned he'd forgotten one more file of the office, and I was passing by. My heart gave a small, unsteady beat. Not at all. He's resting, but I can give it to him. He handed me the folder, and for a moment our fingers touched again. The same quiet current passed between us, gentle, unspoken, undeniable. We stood there in the sunlight, two people who hadn't meant to meet again so soon, saying words that didn't quite match what we felt. "Thank you, Linda," he said softly. "I'll let you get back to your day." I nodded, but before he turned to leave, he hesitated. "You know, if you ever want to get out of the house for a coffee, or just talk, I'd be glad to listen. Sometimes it's nice to have someone outside the usual circle." I didn't answer right away. The breeze rustled the hydrangeas, scattering a few pale petals onto the grass. Finally, I said, "That's a kind offer, Michael. I'll think about it." He smiled, a small, understanding smile, and walked back to his car. When the sound of his engine faded, I stood there for a long while, the folder still in my hand, my pulse steady but awake. That night, as Tom slept beside me, the moonlight spilling across the sheets, I found myself staring at the ceiling, wondering how a simple visit, a few words, and a cup of coffee had opened a door inside me I didn't even know was closed. And somewhere deep down, I already knew that door wasn't going to shut so easily again. The following week passed in that strange, in-between way that ordinary life sometimes does, each day full but oddly hollow at the same time. Tom went back to his usual routine, leaving early, returning late, often distracted by work even when he was home. I told myself that was fine, that it had been that way for years. And yet the quiet in the evenings began to feel heavier. I tried to fill it, reading, cooking, gardening, but small moments reminded me of what had shifted. I'd catch myself checking my phone more often than usual, though I couldn't say exactly what I was waiting for. Sometimes I thought about messaging Michael first, but each time I stopped myself. It didn't feel right. Then one Wednesday afternoon, while I was dusting the shelves in the living room, my phone buzzed. A message from him. "Are you busy? There's a small cafe on Willow Street that has the best blueberry muffins. Thought you might enjoy a change of scenery." I stood there, cloth in hand, staring at the screen. I could almost hear his voice, calm, considerate, never pushing, never demanding. Just an invitation, offered with a kind of quiet sincerity that felt rare. I hesitated longer than I cared to admit. Then, before I could talk myself out of it, I typed, "I could use some fresh air. What time?" We met that afternoon. The cafe was tucked away on a quiet corner, the kind of place that still smelled of freshly ground coffee beans and baked bread. When I walked in, he was already there, sitting near the window, sunlight warming the table. He stood as I approached, that same polite habit I'd noticed before. "Linda," he said, his smile genuine. "You made it." "Blueberry muffins, right?" I teased, trying to sound casual. "The best ones in town," he replied, "but I think the company will be even better." I felt a blush creep up my neck. It had been a long time since anyone said something like that to me, not in a rehearsed, obligatory way, but in a way that sounded like they meant it. We talked for a long time, about small things mostly, his family back in Ohio, my garden, how strange it feels when life slows down after decades of motion. It wasn't flirtation, not in the way people think of it. It was more like two people finding comfort in being understood. He had this way of listening that made silence feel safe. He didn't fill the pauses. He let them breathe. And somewhere between the laughter and the stillness, I realized how long it had been since someone truly listened to me, not as a wife or as someone's mother, but as myself. When I got home later that day, the house looked exactly the same, but it felt different. The air seemed heavier, like it was holding a secret I couldn't name. Tom was in the living room, laptop open, half watching the news. He smiled absently when I walked in. "Have a good day?" he asked. "Yes," I said, my voice steady. "Just ran some errands." It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. That night, as I lay beside him, I thought about how marriage changes over time. How the edges soften and the spaces between two people widen quietly until you wake up one day realizing that the person lying next to you feels more like family than passion. Safe, dependable, but distant. The next few days blurred together. Michael and I exchanged a few messages here and there, small things, harmless things. A picture of his dog, a comment about the weather. Yet beneath every word was something unspoken, fragile, and new. One afternoon, he sent, "You seem lighter lately. Happier, even. I hope life's been kinder to you this week." And I found myself smiling at the screen before replying, "Maybe it's just nice to have someone to talk to again." He wrote, "Then I'll take that as a compliment." A week later, I saw him again. He'd offered to help me carry some bags after I mentioned that the grocery delivery service had messed up my order. I told him it wasn't necessary, but he showed up anyway, standing at my doorstep with that same patient smile. "You said you needed help," he said simply. We unpacked the groceries together in the kitchen, laughing about how the store had sent 3 bags of potatoes instead of 1. It felt natural, almost too easy. Then, as I reached for the last item, our hands met again. That same quiet current. I looked up at him, and he didn't look away. His eyes held mine, calm but searching. There was no rush, no sudden gesture, just a shared understanding that something had changed. "Linda," he said softly, almost as if testing the sound of my name. "I don't want to cross any lines. You deserve honesty. I enjoy spending time with you, more than I probably should." The words hung between us, fragile and real. I felt my heartbeat steady, not racing, not afraid, just aware. "I know," I said quietly, "and I don't quite know what to do with that." He nodded slowly. "Maybe we don't have to do anything. Maybe it's enough to just be." It was such a simple thing to say, but it stayed with me long after he left. That evening I stood by the window watching the sunset paint the sky in soft pinks and golds. Tom was still at work, and the house was silent except for the sound of the clock ticking. I thought about how life gives us these small, delicate moments, ones that don't fit neatly into right or wrong. All I knew was that Michael's presence had awakened something in me that had been quiet for too long. Not a longing for love, but a longing for aliveness. Later, when Tom called to say he'd be working late again, I felt a twinge of sadness, not because he wasn't coming home, but because part of me no longer missed him in the way I used to. That night, as I folded the laundry again, the same motion, the same rhythm, I realized that the simple act had begun to carry new meaning. It reminded me that life is always folding and unfolding, soft edges giving way to new shapes. And though nothing had been spoken aloud, I knew deep down that the next step, whatever it was, would change everything. A few weeks passed, and the days began to cool. The long stretch of summer softened into autumn, the air gentler, the sunlight thinner. I found myself lingering over my morning coffee, watching the leaves turn gold outside the kitchen window. There's a certain peace in the change of seasons, a quiet reminder that nothing, not even stillness, stays the same forever. Tom was busier than ever. The new project at his office demanded his full attention, and I rarely saw him without his phone in hand. I told myself I understood. It had always been this way. But lately that understanding came with a quiet ache, the kind that sits just beneath your ribs, where longing and acceptance meet. Michael and I hadn't seen each other in almost 2 weeks. Our messages had slowed, turning from daily check-ins to the occasional polite exchange. I had told myself that was for the best. Things had drifted close to a line neither of us wanted to cross. But even as I told myself that, a part of me missed his presence, the simple comfort of being seen, not as a wife or a role, but as a person. One afternoon, I decided to visit the park near the old library. It was one of those crisp, clear days when the sky feels endless and the world feels honest. I packed a small thermos of tea and a book, hoping the air would settle my thoughts. As I sat on the bench beneath the big oak tree, I felt the soft breeze brush against my face, carrying the scent of leaves and earth. Then I heard a voice behind me. "Didn't expect to find you here." I turned, and there he was, Michael, standing a few steps away, a paper cup in hand, a surprised smile on his face. "Neither did I," I said, returning his smile. Seems we both had the same idea. He sat down beside me, leaving just enough space to be polite, but close enough that I could feel his warmth. We talked for a while, about work, the weather, the strange comfort of quiet days. The conversation was easy, but beneath it all was something heavier, unspoken. After a long pause, he said softly, "I didn't want to make things complicated for you." I looked down at my hands. "You didn't. Life is already complicated. You just reminded me of something I'd forgotten." He tilted his head slightly. "What's that?" "That I'm still here," I said, "still capable of feeling, of noticing the world around me. For a long time, I think I just stopped." He nodded, his eyes steady, kind. "You're not alone in that." We sat in silence after that, a gentle silence filled not with tension, but understanding. The kind of silence that feels like a conversation all its own. Eventually, he reached out and touched my hand, It wasn't a romantic gesture. It was gratitude, connection, a quiet acknowledgement of what had passed between us. "Linda," he said finally, "you've become someone important to me, but I know where we both stand. I'd never want to hurt you or anyone." "I know," I whispered. "And I think that's why this matters so much. Because it's real, but it doesn't have to take more than it gives." He smiled gently. "Then let's just let it be what it is. Something good that found us both at the right time." We stayed there a while longer, watching the sun dip low through the trees. When it was time to leave, there were no promises made, no declarations, just a shared look that said, "I'll remember this." That evening, when I returned home, Tom was in the kitchen reheating leftovers. He looked up when I came in, smiling that familiar, tired smile. "Hey, you were gone for a while. Everything okay?" "Yes," I said softly, setting my bag down. "I just needed a little fresh air." He nodded, returning to his meal, and I stood there for a moment, watching him, the man I had shared my life with for over 3 decades. So much of who I was had been shaped by him, by the years or the quiet routines we built together. After dinner, I joined him on the couch. The news droned softly on the TV, but I wasn't listening. I leaned my head against his shoulder. He seemed surprised for a moment, then gently rested his hand over mine. The warmth of it settled something inside me. It struck me then how love changes form over time. Sometimes it's laughter, sometimes it's distance, and sometimes it's simply the quiet act of staying, of showing up, even when everything feels worn thin. Later that night, as I folded the last load of laundry, the same familiar rhythm, I realized how full life had become again. Not perfect, not simple, but fuller. The world had color again. Michael's presence had opened a window I hadn't realized was closed. But the light that came through wasn't meant to pull me away. It was meant to remind me that even at 57, even after decades of marriage, life still has corners left to explore. When I lay down beside Tom that night, I looked at him and thought about how easily we forget to see the people we love, even when they're right in front of us. Maybe that's what this whole experience had been about. Not longing, but remembering. Remembering how to notice. Before I drifted off to sleep, I whispered to the quiet room, "Sometimes the smallest moments change everything." And I meant it, because they do.